Animation is cinema. Animation is not a genre. And animation is ready to be taken to the next step. We are all ready for it.
Amen.
So not too long ago, the legendary filmmaker Guillermo del Toro put out his latest film in theaters, that being the latest in a long history of adaptations of the classic Mary Shelley novel Frankenstein. This has easily been one of the most highly anticipated films of this year, given just how much respect del Toro himself has earned as a director. He's very likely one of the most acclaimed directors of the 21st century. His movies are incredibly distinctive, usually offering some great dark fantasy storytelling that generally goes in tandem with some very real-life issues and events. He's earned the admiration of fantasy lovers, horror fans, and cinephiles all over the world, and rightfully so. He's also the founder of the animation is cinema movement, which unfortunately was pretty much completely retooled and misinterpreted in all the wrong ways by some of the worst accounts on Twitter imaginable. Cartoon base. So today, I thought it would be fun and very fitting given this spooky time of year to rank all the films of the Monster Man himself, while also giving my in-depth thoughts on them. Guillermo del Toro is easily one of my favorite directors out there, and he's been highly requested for me to discuss more in general here on the channel, so this seems like a ranking tailor-made for me in a lot of ways. And now that I've officially seen his latest film in theaters, which by the way is the best way to watch it, don't wait till Netflix, and all of his other ones, it seems like a good time to do this. So without further ado, let's rank all the films of Guillermo del Toro, the man, the myth, the legend himself. But alas, not all of his movies can be legendary, which is exactly why we have to start off with this.
You are so disappointing on so many levels.
And the shocking pick for the worst Guillermo del Toro film is Blade 2. Bet you weren't expecting that, huh? In general, I would say that del Toro has very few films where I actually felt like I got nothing out of watching them, and unfortunately, Blade 2 is exactly one of those movies. This is one of the most nothing movies I have ever seen, and also it's a very bad sequel to a movie that I think has actually aged pretty well. I don't think enough people realize just how big of an impression the first Blade movie made when it came out, especially since it came out during a time when comic book movies weren't really seen in a good light. You can thank Batman and Robin for that. Thanks Joel Schumacher for giving us one of the cringiest superhero movies ever made. But when Blade came out, based on the Marvel Comics character of the same name, who is a vampire hunter who is half vampire himself, the pendulum started to swing back to comic book movies being considered cool again. This is a film that absolutely embodies the rule of cool, but also still has a lot of emotion and good story beats to go with it too. It has an absolutely fantastic and very creative opening sequence with the vampire rave scene, which still goes hard to this day. Pretty much every fight still looks good in this movie, especially because Wesley Snipes is a trained martial artist, so the film actually used that to its advantage. And it manages to balance this blend of both incredibly cool but also incredibly absurd scenes as well, like this one where this vampire throws a Japanese girl into the street. How did she even survive that? Her organs should be crushed. This film really knew how to balance these two tones expertly well, and like I said, there's some genuinely good emotional scenes in this film too, like when Blade sees his mentor die. And it's really the first time we actually see Blade show any emotion throughout that film, and it feels like a very earned moment. But Blade 2 honestly has absolutely none of this, and it's really frustrating. Right from the get-go, we start Blade 2 off showing Blade trying to revive his mentor who died in the last film, which was a very emotional moment, and guess what? He does so. He actually goes straight to the vampire's hideout, where apparently they've been hiding his mentor, whose name is Whistler by the way, this whole time, and preserving him in a giant vat of blood. So Whistler has literally been alive this whole time. His death meant nothing apparently in the last film, and then Blade just goes, grabs him, and wakes him up again. Like, why? Then what was the point of his death in the last movie? That is the only time in that film we actually see Blade show emotion, and that's supposed to be important for his character. So it feels like a major regression when this sequel decides to just go back on that randomly and be like, oh hey, he's not dead actually, he's totally fine, Blade's here to pick him up. It's just such a mind-boggling narrative thing. But even outside of that, I think one of the worst things about Blade 2 is that it's not really that different from Blade 1 at all. It literally has the exact same climax as the first Blade movie. Blade gets captured by the vampires, he gets really weak, then he has to drink a lot of blood, get a power-up, and then beat up all the vampires. This was already in the first movie, why are you showing me this again? And even just structurally comparing the final fight in this film to the one in the first one, it's also just weaker on that merit because unfortunately this film uses CGI a lot for its fights. A big reason a lot of the fights from the first film actually still hold up even today is because they're all practical and they actually took advantage of the fact that Wesley Snipes is a trained martial artist. In this film, almost 80% of the fights are just CGI, and they're not really that good looking at all as a result. In fact, they're kind of ugly sometimes. It really feels like a night and day comparison when you compare the fights in this film to the first Blade. On top of this, it introduces a lot of characters that don't really feel meaningful to the story at all. The basic plot of Blade 2 is that there's a bunch of super vampires going around, so Blade has to team up with a group of vampires to try and take down the super vampires since they're a threat to both of them. But whoa, this group of vampires was actually tricking him, and they stab him in the back and then take him to get executed. Oh boy, I sure didn't see that one coming. But even if we're just looking at the time that the vampires are actually on Blade's side, they don't really offer anything at all for the audience to actually get invested in with them. Like, this super vampire leader is basically just a lamer version of the guy from Blade Runner, where he's mad at his father for creating him and wants revenge. Just watch Blade Runner instead of watching Blade 2. You'll get a much better version of that. Actually, watch Blade 1 instead of watching Blade 2. It's astonishing to me how many times this film takes things from the first movie and then just does them even worse. From what I've gathered, Del Toro actually wasn't really wanting to be on this movie at all, which definitely shows with it, and really only signed on so he could direct the Hellboy movies later on. Which, thankfully, he had a lot better luck with those, and there's actual real passion that you can see in those films in general. But for Blade 2, nah. I know this might be a very divisive pick, since I know a lot of people who actually really like this movie and even consider it better than the first film. But for me, this is by and large just a weaker version of the first Blade movie. Watch Blade 1, don't watch Blade 2. That's about all I gotta say about this one, because honestly, it's just such a nothing burger of a film. Hopefully the next movie will be an improvement here.
Red Rocket, come on.
Well, I sure miscalculated. Crimson Peak is such a baffling and absurd film, and not in a good way at all. So for a bit of background on this one, Del Toro was actually supposed to make a Haunted Mansion movie for Disney in the early 2010s. However, around the same time, he was also developing Pacific Rim and was supposed to do a Justice League Dark movie for Warner Brothers that unfortunately got cancelled. He was also busy directing the Silent Hill PT demo for Konami around this time, so due to balancing so many different things, he had to step back from directing the project for Disney. However, it's very clear that a lot of the ideas he initially had for that Haunted Mansion movie with Disney really stuck with him, and also Disney really wanted to make a Haunted Mansion movie just in general. So because of that, Del Toro took his own ideas that he developed while working with Disney on the Haunted Mansion project and made Crimson Peak, while much later Disney made the 2023 Haunted Mansion movie. Neither of which are good things at all. The plot essentially follows a young female writer who sees ghosts who tell her not to go to Crimson Peak, and all the while she's writing her manuscripts for the book she wants to publish and having them critiqued by a man played by Tom Hiddleston. And all the while she's slowly falling in love with Tom Hiddleston, which, you know, who wouldn't? That man has unmatched charisma. She ends up meeting his sister too, who has a very strangely close relationship with Tom Hiddleston. Oh, they're in an incest relationship. Yay! Yeah, so this isn't the thing that turned me off from the movie completely, but it's definitely pretty worth noting if you actually want to watch this, because it's pretty triggering, not gonna lie. So Tom Hiddleston and his sister are in an ancestral relationship, apparently, and also trying to kill this girl because they want her inheritance money. This film is unfortunately very predictable. You can always tell what's gonna happen next at pretty much every second within this film in general. Generally, I don't like pointing that out about a film because really there's nothing original under the sun, and every film does its own thing to sort of subvert different tropes and expectations that the audience generally had. I don't think there's anything wrong with adapting a particular formula or putting your own spin on it, but the weird thing is, Del Toro doesn't really seem to be doing that here at all. I think the biggest issue I have with this film is that it's played completely straight. It feels less like he actually wants to play with and subvert these tropes, and more like he's just putting them directly in front of the audience's eye, which, I'll be completely honest, I kind of expect a lot better from someone like Del Toro. Something he's done throughout his entire career is basically subverting audience expectations and transforming different genres, mostly dark fantasy and monster type genres. He's been very good at playing with those kinds of motifs for a really long time, but here it doesn't really feel like he's doing that at all. Everything is just played completely straight with no personal Del Toro touch actually added, which makes this film incredibly frustrating. I think a good example of a film that's actually very similar to this one, but actually does subvert the audience's expectations would be The Village by M. Night Shyamalan. On the surface, it just looks like another gothic romance fantasy, much like Crimson Peak actually is, but if you look deeper, it's a much more interesting dissect dissection of being able to erase one's past, and the desire to forget and cover up things from your past so you never actually have to grow or mature from them. I'm keeping that as vague as possible to not spoil The Village, by the way. Very much recommend that film. Also, shockingly, it's a Disney movie, and it still managed to be better than Crimson Peak. I think the only thing I actually really liked about this film was probably Tom Hiddleston's character. He's really the only interesting part of this entire film, and I actually found myself getting very invested in his journey throughout this film overall. But even he's not enough to save it, unfortunately. The main girl's not that interesting despite a very good performance from her, and honestly, Tom Hiddleston's sister in this film is terrible. I don't know what happened here exactly, but holy crap, she was not putting any effort into her performance in this film whatsoever. Sometimes I felt like I was watching a Disney Channel movie at the way she acted. Anyway, I think I've said enough about Crimson Peak. Let's hope that the next film is at least better than this.
It's a Mr. Mime. They're the worst.
No, sadly, it was not. Mimic might be one of the most painful things I've ever had to sit through. Holy crap, I don't even know where to begin with this one. So I guess for a bit of history, this is actually Del Toro's first ever English language film that he directed over at Miramax in the late 90s. This is back when Miramax was still owned by Disney and also had their Dimension Films label attached to them that distributed horror films like Scream, which proved very popular. These sorts of meta-teen horror films like Scream or I Know What You Did Last Summer were proving very popular with audiences during this time in the 90s. However, Del Toro was looking to adapt a Donald A. Wollheim story for his first ever English language horror film. This short story was about a scientist couple who end up experimenting on a cockroach and create a subspecies of giant cockroach that end up almost taking over the entirety of New York City. These cockroaches are also super adaptable and can try to look like humans and mimic their movements. Huh, get it guys? That's why the movie's called Mimic. But unfortunately for Del Toro, since he was making this film with Miramax, he unfortunately had to deal with the Weinsteins, and that was a huge mistake. Around this time, the Weinsteins were incredibly notorious for always bungling a number of different film projects, since they would always ask for a number of cuts and outright demand them from various filmmakers. Whenever a filmmaker would submit a draft to the Weinsteins, it was always inevitable that they would get a bunch of aggressive demands demanding that they cut or alter several aspects of their film. And usually this would happen multiple times over, so of course it was pretty miserable for any filmmaker that wanted to work with Miramax. Unfortunately for Del Toro, it was no different for him, and by the time he actually got the film to theaters, it was not the film he'd originally envisioned. In fact, he would later go on to say that his time at Miramax was so miserable that he would change how he directed movies entirely going forward after making Mimic. Which, I'll be honest, is both a good thing and a very sad thing that he had to deal with that to begin with. But thankfully, there actually is a director's cut version of Mimic, which is actually the version that I watched for this review. But after watching it, I was incredibly confused, so I ended up watching both the theatrical version and the director's cut version for the purpose of this video. And I can tell you up front, after having seen both versions of this film, I don't think there was any saving it whatsoever. This is such a mess of a movie that, again, unfortunately like Crimson Peak, plays things far too straight and also just ends up being incredibly boring all throughout. This movie isn't even that long, it's just under 2 hours, but I found myself wanting it to be over by the halfway point. I think in some ways you could perhaps make the argument that this is actually worse than Crimson Peak since it doesn't even have the luxury of having good performances in it. The acting here is atrocious on all fronts from every person involved in this film. Like, they got the guy who plays Salieri from Amadeus in this movie, and even he can't save it. If there's one positive I can give this film, it's probably the creature designs of the bugs themselves. Like, when they're in mimic form, they actually are pretty eerie and also very cool looking. But great creature designs can obviously only get you so far when your story isn't really that interesting or in-depth, and also your acting falls pretty flat on all fronts. Also, fun fact, this is actually one of the first big movies that Thanos was in. Yep, Josh Brolin is in this movie, believe it or not. I mean, I'm glad he at least got to do Deadpool 2 eventually after this, because oh boy, if I were him, I would not want this stain of a movie on my resume forever. I think the one thing that kinda saves Mimic, at least more so than Crimson Peak or Blade 2, is that at least it's kind of funny bad at times. Like, there's some scenes that end up being so off the wall crazy when they're actually supposed to be scary that this film does end up being pretty funny at times. So it has that at least as some sort of merit to it. But overall, I can't really say I recommend Mimic. This wasn't a very good movie. Play Empire of Ants instead. Well, the good news is, after doing those 3 bad movies, we're finally onto the stuff that I actually like to varying degrees, starting with...
You weren't even the bomb sponsor from the CG was cracking!
Okay, yeah, Pacific Rim is pretty fun. It makes sense that this is Del Toro's highest grossing film since it's definitely the one with the most mainstream appeal. It's just a fun action blockbuster that's a big homage to kaiju movies and also mecha anime. Especially with how they show the mechs work in this movie, I got a lot of Evangelion vibes from it. And also, the creature designs in this movie inevitably are absolutely fantastic. That is something that Del Toro always seems to do very, very well on. This film also very much became a science fiction cult hit after its release, kind of like Edge of Tomorrow or Tron Legacy also did. And having seen it, I absolutely see why this is a very popular film with a very dedicated fan base. I think the only problem I really have with this film is that I don't think many of the characters are actually that interesting in it. In something like Evangelion, for instance, which obviously this film is taking a lot of influence from, each character in that show is incredibly fleshed out. We get in-depth looks at the main character Shinji and why he doesn't feel like opening up to people and his desire to be seen by others in general, since he's always felt like his father has neglected him. We get a really in-depth psychological look at Asuka and why she always feels like she has to prove she's better than everybody else, and also her incredibly traumatic and downright depressing backstory. Practically every character in Evangelion is very well fleshed out and shows why they do the things they do in the show. And we actually have a very similar type of cast to Evangelion in this movie, but the issue is none of them are really that well fleshed out at all. I can't even remember the main character's name in this film because he was just so uninteresting and didn't really leave an impression on me at all. The Japanese woman who ends up being his companion inside of the mech, which they call Jaegers in this film, actually did have potential to be pretty interesting in my opinion. She has a pretty traumatic backstory and a real reason to fight back against the kaiju and be part of this organization to begin with. But honestly, even she didn't really leave anything to take away from either. And no shade to any of the actors in this film at all, since there are a lot of great performances here, but unfortunately the writing behind each character leaves a lot to be desired. I think the only character here who really left an impact on me, and in my opinion should have been the main character here from the start, was easily Charlie Day's character. He plays this scientist named Dr. Newton Geisler who is trying to study the kaiju and also ends up performing a brain connection with one of the kaiju as well. He gets so excited when he gets to learn something new about a kaiju or see a kaiju body part, and he's like the most autistic person ever, and it's amazing. I freaking loved his character here, and he definitely stole the show. Man, Warner Brothers, where's the Charlie Day Pacific Rim spin-off TV show? I need that. He's really good in this film, and I think he's the main thing that I really took away from it. And don't get me wrong, this is a very fun film, but I will say I do expect more depth from someone like Del Toro. I think in some ways you could actually argue this doesn't really feel like a Del Toro film at all. But it's absolutely a fun time, and I definitely see why it's considered a science fiction cult classic from this era. And also it's a film I would actually watch again, unlike Blade 2, Crimson Peak, or Mimic, so at least it has that going for it.
Shadow, it's me, the devil.
I actually don't think I've ever got an opportunity to talk about this before, but I absolutely love Hellboy. I grew up pretty much surrounded by the comics, especially since they were published here in my home state of Oregon. And as a result, this was actually the first ever Del Toro movie that I watched back in the day. Del Toro is pretty famously a big comic book fan, and he also really knows a lot about the medium and is very educated. It's a big reason he was initially supposed to do a Justice League Dark film for the DCEU before that got scrapped by Warner Brothers. Also, totally unrelated fun fact, he's a huge gamer as well, and he said that Shadow of the Colossus and Ico are actually big influences on his work, which honestly really makes sense, and those are two of the greatest games ever made. It's also because of this that people have said he should make a film version of Shadow of the Colossus, although, to be honest, I think that game is best just kept as a game. Although I could definitely see him adapting something like Ico pretty well, or even something like Gravity Rush. Man, what I would give to see a Del Toro version of Gravity Rush or Ico. And you can really see that passion all over the first Hellboy movie, and it's also the first movie that Del Toro was really allowed to go a little more crazy with some of his creature designs. That's obviously something that he's been known for throughout his entire career, and I think it's the first Hellboy movie where you really start to see that. And while Hellboy isn't technically one of the most one-to-one comic accurate films out there, it's definitely one of the best comic book films from this era. And there is a real reason why people do look back fondly on this film. However, while this is legitimately a good movie, and I think it actually has aged very well, all things considered, I think the one issue with it is that Hellboy actually isn't really the main character in this film. That honor would actually go to John Myers, who starts the film off as the newest agent in the BPRD and actually ends up being sort of a POV for the audience getting into this world as a result. However, because of this, I feel like this doesn't really feel like a true Hellboy movie since he's not even really the main character here. Another issue I have is how sloppily they handle Hellboy's relationship with Liz. They have a romance in this film that feels really forced, honestly, and I don't think Liz actually has that much character or depth to her whatsoever, and she doesn't have that much agency either. I do think this is remedied in the second film, however, which we'll get to later. And obviously, both of the Hellboy movies do take a lot of creative liberties from the comics, since technically Hellboy isn't actually set in a highly urban setting to begin with. Generally, we often see Hellboy exploring a lot more ancient or old-timey locations in the comics, like old castles or old-fashioned towns. The movie ditches this to have a more modern setting, I guess, since that was very in at the time. It feels very much like it's aping off of X-Men or Men in Black because of this. Especially with how they handle the BPRD, there's definitely a lot of that Men in Black influence, which I guess also makes sense because, fun fact, Men in Black is also a comic book movie. But in general, despite those shortcomings, Hellboy actually holds up pretty well, all things considered. There were a lot, and I mean a lot of comic book movies in the 2000s that don't hold up today and weren't really good when they came out whatsoever, so the fact Hellboy is as good as it is and still holds up today is kind of a miracle. Also, low-key, it's kind of a perfect movie to watch going from Halloween into the Thanksgiving season.
I don't say blah blah blah.
And here we have the movie that started it all, the first movie that Del Toro ever directed, Cronos, all the way back in 1993. I was very skeptical going into this one since naturally a lot of first directorial projects tend not to always be the best or go over so well, but this one I was actually kind of blown away by. For someone's first ever film, this is kind of amazing. A lot of directors can very easily strike out on their first film and only be able to build up their career over time after that, but this one actually is really good right off the bat. You can already see a lot of the motifs that Del Toro would later on use in many of his projects in this first film, probably most notably the humanization of the monster as a major theme. And also having an innocent wide-eyed child face something very adult and very dark head on, which is also something that Del Toro would deal a lot with in later films as well. The basic premise of Cronos essentially follows an elderly antique shop owner who comes across a device shaped like a scarab that seemingly grants him eternal life. After letting this scarab prick him and filter his blood through a creature inside of it, he ends up getting a lot of his youthful disposition back. His skin starts to look a lot smoother, he's able to be more romantically involved with his wife, and he's also able to walk easier too. But of course, just like every encounter with a mythical object, this also comes at a very distinct cost. While the scarab has granted him immortality, he's also developed a very distinct taste for blood. Yep, our boy is a vampire now. I feel like vampire films, especially in more recent memory, have developed a reputation for not being very good, like, at all.
I'm the world's most dangerous predator. Everything about me invites you in.
Man, shut the f up.
But this one is 100% one of the better ones out there. Especially given a lot of the other horror movies that were coming out during this era, it's nice to see a horror movie that still has a lot of humanity within it. Which, of course, is something that Del Toro would become famous for later on. You can also see his trademark method of deconstructing and subverting different horror tropes in order to tap into more specific social political themes also starting here as well. There are some story things that I'm not going to delve too deeply into in this review since, honestly, I think this film is actually best experience for yourself, but I definitely do recommend Cronos. It's a great vampire thriller and an incredibly good start to a well-respected career from one of my favorite directors.
Citizens, I need firepower.
Who are you? Your worst nightmare.
Nightmare Alley is really good. Like, really, really good. I'm honestly just very surprised this film actually got made, especially under the tutelage of a studio like Disney, no less. This film is actually technically a remake of the 1947 film of the same name, which in of itself is based on a 1946 novel. Given this film initially released in the 40s, it's very much a noir film in every sense of the word, and this remake really embodies that wholeheartedly, which is a big reason why I'm really surprised it actually got made today at all. I feel like you just don't see movies like this anymore, or even movies that are callbacks to that noir era overall. I feel like if anything, we see more films that call back to the 1970s, like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood or The Nice Guys, rather than the 1940s or 30s noir era. Which honestly sucks because film noir is one of my personal favorite genres, and thankfully Nightmare Alley really embodies that wholeheartedly. There was definitely a lot going against this film given A, it was a Searchlight Pictures film made under Disney, and B, it was made during the midst of the pandemic. In fact, shooting for this film actually started in January of 2020, and then they had to stop in March of 2020 and resume 6 months later, which to some degree I think you can see in the final product, which I'll get into here in a bit. The film stars Bradley Cooper in honestly one of his better performances in recent memory as someone who ends up working for a carnival. This man, whose name is Stan, ends up learning from the carnival workers how to do a cold read on somebody and use different tricks to deceive them into thinking that you can read their future. However, his ability to use these tricks gradually goes to his head over the course of the film, and he ends up biting off more than he can chew with more than a few clients. I won't go into too much detail about the story for this one, since kind of like Chronos, I think it is best experience for yourself, but this is a very, very well done noir callback. Again, I just really miss seeing these kinds of films, and it's really nice to see one that came out not even that long ago that has an impeccable quality to it. I think the only real complaint I have about Nightmare Alley is that the first hour of this film is incredibly poorly paced. The film spends basically an hour in the carnival setting up Stan's character and showing him learning the cold reading abilities, when really it didn't need to spend that long on doing that. But when you look at the hectic production of this film under Disney during the pandemic, it becomes very clear actually why the film feels like this. According to Del Toro himself, this film actually had its second half filmed before the first, and the second half was completed before the pandemic started. However, of course, when the pandemic started, Disney halted production on the film, and eventually after 6 months, everybody came back and started working on the film again under precautions. As a result, the first half of this film, which was made after the second, feels very disjointed from the rest of the movie. And while the rest of this film is great, and I would just say this film is good in general, the second half is pretty noticeably slower than the first, and I do have to knock the film for that. I think under better circumstances, this film could have come out feeling a lot more complete, but unfortunately that's just how things were during this time. And unfortunately now we're still seeing the repercussions of that, since it's a lot harder for people to get back into theaters, oh boy. But overall, I really recommend Nightmare Alley. It's a great callback to an era of film that we just don't really see represented anymore at all. After making something as atrocious as Mimic, The Devil's Backbone is really Del Toro coming back in full force, and I love it. Given just how miserable it seemed making his first ever English language film was for him, it kinda makes sense he would go back to doing a Spanish language film that was far away from the main Hollywood circuit and also far away from the Weinsteins. I can't really say I blame him there whatsoever. Also, by the way, if you'd like to see me do more director rankings like this, let me know down below. If you'd like to see me rank all the Wes Anderson films or the Edgar Wright films or something like that. I know people often ask for my thoughts on very specific movies, so this might be an easy way to get them out there for you guys. But regardless, yeah, The Devil's Backbone is great, and it's a really good ghost story too. This was 2 years after The Sixth Sense came out, so films about ghosts with kids as a main part of the narrative were definitely on the mainstream audience mind. But thankfully, Devil's Backbone really sets itself apart as its own unique thing. This is very much a Spanish film through and through, given it actually does take place during the Spanish Civil War. The story focuses on Carlos, a young boy who ends up at an orphanage during this time in Spanish history and also encounters a ghost of a boy who is drowned here at this orphanage. The entire main cast here is made up of young boys, which honestly I was surprised by all the acting from each of them here. These are all legitimately really good child actors. I feel like in general, child actors can be very hit or miss, looking at you Dumbo 2019, but here it's really good. Del Toro really seems to know what he's doing when it comes to directing kids, and he usually brings out the best of them, like in this, in Chronos, and especially in Pan's Labyrinth. Each of these boys gives a really stellar performance, and it's really great to see overall. Apparently the kid who played Carlos actually won Best Young Actor in an international film at the MT Movie Awards, which definitely makes sense. I don't want to dive too deeply into the story for this one either, because it definitely is one also very much worth experiencing for yourself, but let's just say it has a lot of great social commentary on war in general. This is something that Del Toro tends to exceed with his films in general, since a lot of them end up being very good deconstructions of war and fascism, which, especially these days, I think is something that we need more than ever. And I think it's really with this film that you see Del Toro's signature style really cemented in general, especially when you compare Devil's Backbone to something like Pan's Labyrinth, since both are films that play with different horror and fantasy tropes to comment directly on a very real moment in history and a very real war. But overall, Devil's Backbone is really great, and Del Toro actually does consider it to be his first real film, which, yeah, I agree.
Comedy gold.
Hellboy 2 is a much better film than the first one, and it's not even a contest. I will say, this is arguably an even less comic accurate look at Hellboy than the first movie was, but it's also just by far a better movie. You can really see that after Pan's Labyrinth, studios were a lot more willing to let Del Toro just go ham on movies, and he absolutely does that here. You can really see he just was locked in completely on Hellboy 2 and just going absolutely nuts, and he turned down a lot of other projects around this time to make Hellboy 2. It was actually around this time that Peter Jackson asked Del Toro to make a Halo movie with him over at Fox and Universal, and he turned that down for Hellboy, which in some ways I'm kinda glad that movie never happened, but we also got the Halo TV show because of that, which is its own bag of blech. He even turned down directing I Am Legend and Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince just to do this movie. That's how dedicated he was to Hellboy 2. And I think because of all that passion brimming into this movie, it just ends up being a much better film than the first one was. First off, Hellboy is actually the main character in this film, which thank God, I'm glad John Myers is gone. Hellboy actually gets to be the star of his own movie for once, which he should have been in the first film to begin with. Also, Liz is actually allowed to be a real character in this film since she wasn't really given any agency in the first movie, and her romance with Hellboy is much more fleshed out in this movie too. There's also some great additions to the cast this time around, such as Luke Goss as the main villain, this evil elf prince who wants to wipe out all of humanity with the titular Golden Army. He acts as a really good foil and challenge to Hellboy's own mentality of protecting humanity, despite the both of them being seen as supernatural freaks and outcasts by humanity. Also, of all people, Seth MacFarlane is actually also a really good addition to this film as Johann Cross. He's got a really likable role in this film, and I couldn't help but smile whenever I saw his character come on screen. He's basically just doing a German version of Stewie throughout this film, but it's still really great.
Yes, well, you know, I turn to poetry when matters of the heart weigh heavily on me. If you're happy and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands.
You get to see even more of Del Toro's signature creature designs in this film too, especially when they enter the supernatural bazaar in that one scene in the film. Also, most of the creatures in this film are practical effects, which is kind of incredible. I'm really glad Del Toro just was allowed to basically go crazy with this movie by Universal, and as a result it ends up being a far better film than the first Hellboy. Unfortunately, despite technically being a box office success, it had the unfortunate luxury of opening a week before The Dark Knight. I feel like this film could have earned a lot more money had it not opened in front of something like The Dark Knight, but unfortunately we can't change the past, and we never got Hellboy 3 because of that. And instead we got the crappy 2019 reboot, which I still wish had never happened. But overall, Hellboy 2 is absolutely a film that really stands the test of time, and I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it before. Especially during a year where two giant comic book films came out in the form of The Dark Knight and Iron Man, Hellboy 2 is a very distinctly unique experience in of itself. And I think it's worth checking out just for that alone.
It's alive! It's alive!
We've finally come to Del Toro's latest film, Frankenstein. And man, I mean it when this is one of the best adaptations of Frankenstein to date. It's also by far one of the most book-accurate adaptations of this story to date as well. You can really tell that Del Toro has a real passion for this story in particular and wanted to make one of the most accurate adaptations of it that he could. This is a film that plays it very much by the book, and I think that really works in its benefit. I saw this one in theaters since thankfully Netflix is doing a limited theatrical release for this film before dropping it on their streaming service, and you really get to appreciate just how beautiful this film is when seeing it on the big screen. I'm not sure if this film will still be in theaters near you when I put this video out, but if you can, please go see this on the big screen. That really is the best way to experience this. The film is basically the traditional Frankenstein story, although it definitely is far more faithful to the book than a lot of the adaptations of this story have been in the past. It stars Oscar Isaac in the role of Victor Frankenstein, the scientist who wants to play God and makes a man out of different recycled body parts. Honestly, this film's cast is really stacked overall. Outside of Oscar Isaac, we've also got Christoph Waltz, Mia Goth, and even David Bradley, who Del Toro worked with previously on Pinocchio. He actually voiced Geppetto in that film, so it was really nice to see him return for Frankenstein as well. The whole cast really does give it their all with some truly beautiful performances, but I think Jacob Elordi as Frankenstein's monster really does steal the show here. He is absolutely phenomenal in this role, and I think he's one of the most humanized and compassionate looks at Frankenstein's monster that we've really ever seen before. I remember remember being pretty skeptical about him being cast as a monster in this film when that was first announced, but he really does a great job here and shows a real range of acting chops. I'm kinda hoping he gets a nomination for Best Supporting Actor at the awards next year, because he really turned in a great performance. There's a lot of really great little moments with him, like him befriending Mia Goth's character, Elizabeth, and him actually receiving the first ever positive attention that he's ever gotten from anyone from her. And as a result, her name is the first name he's able to learn outside of his creator's name. And also learning to read from the blind man played by David Bradley, who thinks he's the spirit of the forest and doesn't judge him just based on his appearance because he can't see him. So as a result, he has the best ability to just judge the creature as a person. It's really great small moments that make this film just genuinely beautiful. I was very skeptical going into this film, I will admit, but I think Del Toro really has pulled off one of the best adaptations of Frankenstein ever. Like I said before, if you can, see this on the big screen, it is absolutely worth your time. And I am really excited, especially after this, seeing whatever Del Toro does next.
Fish are friends, not food.
The Shape of Water is a film I honestly did not expect to love as much as I did. It is a film that speaks so deeply to feeling isolated and like you can't relate to anyone else around you and just being seen as different by society as a whole. And yet, despite all that, the film gets right along those kinds of people and tells them they are loved no matter what, and that their differences are what make them them. And that, as you can probably imagine, as an autistic person, is something that really hit deeply for me. I think in a lot of ways, this film actually speaks really deeply to the autistic experience far more than most films that are explicitly about autism actually do. And it's kind of just a film that reaffirms anyone who's ever felt like an outcast in society in general. It's a really gorgeous film, and it's the film that won Del Toro his first ever Oscar for Best Picture, and rightfully so. This man has always had so much passion with every film he's ever made, and I think you can really see that some of the most in something like The Shape of Water. This film is a very clear homage to classic creature features, probably most notably the creature from the Black Lagoon. And it's also set during 1960s America, during a time of revolution and change for human rights overall. And you can really see that's what the focal point of this film is exactly about, especially when you look at the main cast of characters here. The main cast of characters we focus on here are a black woman, a gay man, and a mute woman. Three of the kinds of people that would have been the most ostracized in the 1960s and arguably are still even ostracized today. I think arguably this film just ages better and better as time goes on, especially with how blatantly anti-fascist it is too. Elisa, who is the main mute woman that we follow as the primary protagonist throughout this film, works at a science facility that has captured an aquatic creature that bears a striking resemblance to the creature from the Black Lagoon. While this facility wants to take advantage of the creature and use it to their benefit during the Cold War, Elisa actually ends up befriending the creature. Throughout her entire life, she's always felt like she can't be heard by people, not even just because she is mute, but because she's always looked down on just as a woman. But for the first time in her life, she actually feels heard by this creature. Because the creature doesn't look at her simply because of her disability, it looks at her as a real person and sees the kindness that she's bestowing upon it. And I think in some ways, this could be seen as a really good allegory for how neurodivergent people often are able to see other neurodivergent people on a level that just anyone else really can't. Generally, neurotypical people can't really see why neurodivergent people do the things they do or why they are the way they are, and as a result, neurodivergent people generally don't feel heard by neurotypical people. But usually when they meet another neurodivergent person, there's that sort of mutual understanding of each other and why they do the things they do, and it can be a really validating and really beautiful experience. And honestly, I think that's something this film does really well. I think this is easily one of the best things Del Toro has ever done throughout his long storied career, and it really did deserve Best Picture when it came out. You can really tell that he wanted to make a film that spoke directly to people that have never felt like they fit in and have always felt incomplete. And I think he really accomplished that here. This is such a gorgeous film, and if you haven't seen it, please do yourself a favor and check it out. There is so much passion brimming throughout every corner of this film, and it's really a film that speaks directly to those that want to be heard, like Del Toro himself said during his Academy Awards speech. Del Toro has always been one of the biggest advocates for having people and their voices be heard all over, and that's why I love him and his work so much. And I think nothing really exemplifies that better than The Shape of Water. Please go watch it if you haven't. You won't regret it.
Eve, is that the deal? It gets you out of the grid, you turn Pinocchio into a real boy?
And finally, we have the film that I think most people clicked on this video for, if you follow me, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio. One of the finest adaptations of Pinocchio to date, and I think easily one of del Toro's best films ever. There is so much love sprinkled all over this film, not even just for the original Pinocchio story, but also just for the medium of animation in general. This is also where the animation as cinema movement started, since at the Oscars acceptance speech for winning Best Animated Feature for this film, del Toro gave that exact line. Although, for better or for worse, that line has been taken out of context a lot and applied to films that don't really speak to what that initial message was going for whatsoever, but that's neither here nor there. What does matter is this version of Pinocchio really does hammer home the point that animation is cinema. It's not a genre, it's a medium, as Brad Bird would say. You can tell any story you want in animation for any age group, and it's with this mentality that I think this version of Pinocchio ends up being one of the most in-depth and by far one of the most unique. I think one of the most notable changes is that instead of being set in late 1800s Italy, it's actually set in Italy during World War II. And of course, as a result of this, del Toro also does tap into a lot of anti-fascist themes with this film as well. One of the main antagonists, in fact, is actually a fascist leader played by Ron Perlman. He tries to use the fact that Pinocchio is immortal as an advantage and try to make him the ultimate soldier for Italy, which of course doesn't go so well. Pinocchio at its core as a story has always been a really in-depth exploration of morality and what it really means to be human. And I think out of all the adaptations of Pinocchio out there, outside of things that are more loose adaptations like AI artificial intelligence, this ends up probably being the most in-depth look at that. This film is completely stop-motion animated, which to me is the form of animation that I have the utmost respect for. When it comes to all forms of animation, be it 2D or 3D, stop-motion is by far the most painstaking and requires the most dedication to do. With something like 2D animation, and of course CGI, you have digital techniques that can aid the process and speed it up a little bit. But with stop motion, you do not have that luxury whatsoever. It is about as old-fashioned as it gets, and I have the utmost respect for people that choose this art form. And when it's done right, it can look absolutely gorgeous, and this film is no exception. This film was actually animated at a studio local to me, Shadow Machine, which is here in Oregon, and they really did a bang-up job with everything about this film. It looks incredible. This is also probably the most faithful version of Pinocchio out there, since it's a very dark movie, just like the original story is. It taps into the ideas of grief and death far more than any other previous adaptation had, and it really goes more into the idea of Pinocchio being created simply as a mistake, part of a drunken rage that Geppetto was in mourning his lost son. Also, with the fascist setting here, we get a lot more tapping into that as well, with Pinocchio being seen as an outcast and a mistake in a fascist society, which obviously does not bode well for him at all. Ultimately though, I would say this is a film about celebrating life and not really fearing death at all. And this is something that both Pinocchio and Geppetto learn alongside each other throughout the entirety of this film. Honestly, I don't think there's ever gonna be a version of Pinocchio quite like this one ever again. It really does stand out as its own unique, beautiful product, and it did deserve the Best Animated Feature award the year it came out. I really cannot wait to see what del Toro does next with animation, since apparently he's working on another stop-motion movie as we speak. But man, if he can create something with as much of a statement about animation being a real art form as this did, I cannot wait for his next animated project. But as amazing as this film is and as much of a statement as it made, it isn't even his best film. If you've seen this film, you probably already knew this was going to be the top pick all along. It is, in every sense of the word, the quintessential essence of what every Guillermo del Toro film is striving to be. It is the absolute culmination of everything this man has ever made throughout his entire career. It's a fairy tale that shows us that the darkness and sadism of mankind is far scarier than any creature we can conjure in our mind. It's a film that embodies the idea of man being the real monster better than any del Toro film that he's ever made. It really is his magnum opus. I'm hesitant to even call this a film since really it's more like an ethereal experience. Once you've seen something like this, it's never going to leave your mind, ever. There's so many little moments in this film that really hammer home this message overall, like when she meets the Nazi commander and is more terrified of him than when she meets the actual monster, that being the Fawn. She knows she's not really of this world and she feels more comfortable around the creatures that she encounters than the actual people in her life. She's just one little girl caught up in one of the worst periods of human history while also facing off a lot of different fantastical monsters at the same time. It's this sense of duality that the film offers that really makes it stand out, and I think it makes the best use of that out of any Del Toro film, juxtaposing the fantastical monsters with the human monsters in her own life. Much like the rest of the best Del Toro films, it's also a very distinctly anti-fascist film as well. It is set during World War II, much like Pinocchio was, but it takes place in Spain instead of Italy. A lot of the main themes are still at play in this film, however, with the main villain being a fascist commander, just like it was in Pinocchio. This sort of plays a lot like a darker version of Alice in Wonderland meant for grown-ups, and that's actually how Del Toro himself has described this film before. It's a deeply horrifying and unsettling film, but interestingly enough, a lot of the really unsettling moments come from the actual human characters, not so much the monsters. Which, of course, is exactly the point. This film also brought us some of the most iconic monsters in movie history, probably most notably the Pale Man. He is an absolutely terrifying presence, and I think the real terrifying fantasy monster in this film in general. There's a reason that he's so iconic even to this day. He's fantastic. One of the best movie monsters of the 21st century, and also this is just one of the best films of the 21st century, period. Much like The Shape of Water, it's also very much a film about being the outcast, and also does tap into the autistic experience a lot, just like that film did too. Ophelia could be seen very easily as an autistic coded character, since she'd rather read books than actually do anything that other people her age are doing. She gets so lost in the characters and worlds from her books as a form of escapism from her own very cruel, very dark life that she has to deal with. And I think it's because of this, when she actually does encounter a real dark fantasy in real life, she's not really that shocked by it at all. To her, this is far less horrifying than the stuff she actually has to deal with on a daily basis. She's much more interested in understanding the monsters around her than actually fearing them. Ophelia as a protagonist is perhaps the perfect fit for a story like this, since she's the ultimate embodiment of childlike innocence. Very easily capable of making mistakes, but driven by a real desire to do what's right and having hope for the future. Pan's Labyrinth really isn't like anything else out there, and if you haven't seen it yet, you are doing yourself a huge disservice. This is one of those films that feels the most like a magical experience unlike anything else out there, and it is by far Del Toro's magnum opus and my pick for his greatest film that he's ever made. I cannot recommend this one enough. Ooh, that was a long list, but you know what? I was actually very happy to do this video. Del Toro is one of the filmmakers that I have the utmost respect for, and he's easily one of my favorites of all time. If you'd like to see me rank the films of other directors, let me know down below, because I had a lot of fun doing this one, and if this video does well enough, I'd be more than happy to do more of these. But regardless, thank you for coming to the very end of this video, and I hope you enjoyed it or learned something new from it. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, since I do a lot of videos like this in general, talking about both film and animation. You can check out all my socials linked down below, and thank you to my patrons and YouTube members who pitch in with the extra monetary effort to keep me doing what I do here. I appreciate y'all a ton, and I appreciate you for coming to the very end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. For now though, I'll see you on the other side, and happy Halloween to all of you. Bye!